Okay, what is up there YouTube? This is J-Man Time, and today I have a video on some early weapon designs from the former Armalite company that existed from 1954 until 1986. The Armalite company is most notably known for manufacturing the AR-10, the AR-15, series of battle rifles / assault rifles that were used by the U.S. forces and some other NATO allies during the Cold War. Now, the Armalite company was actually founded in 1954 and was originally a division of the Fairchild Airplane and Armaments Company, which existed before the Cold War. Later on, a man named Charles Dorchester, another man named George Sullivan decided to create their own separate armaments company and actually took the Fairchild division and renamed it the Armalite Company starting in 1954. And from 1954 until the mid-1980s, they would produce rifles and carbines for the U.S. Armed Forces and for the civilian market. But in this video, we're going to go over some of the rare prototype weapons of Armalite company that never made it to production stage, including weapons that were designed by Eugene Stoner in the years before he joined Armalite company in 1954. We're going to go over all the prototype weapons all the way up until the introduction of the AR-10, including some AR-10 prototypes. Now, the first Armalite weapon to be developed was the Armalite AR1, also known as the Parasniper. And this was actually designed by Eugene Stoner in 1947, but was not patented until 1954. In 1954, the Armalite company, along with a man named Charles Dorchester, actually took Eugene Stoner's design and rechambered it for an experimental cartridge, the .30 T65 ammunition, which would later evolve into the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge, which would become the standard cartridge. This Armalite AR1 Parasniper was a bolt-action rifle and was fed by an internal magazine, similarly to the previously existing Springfield 03 series of bolt-action rifles that had served the U.S. Army during the First and Second World War. This weapon was meant to be a replacement for that gun, but unfortunately, the Armalite company could not find any buyers within the U.S. military-industrial complex, and they also couldn't find any buyers on the civilian market. So the rifle project was pretty much dropped in 1955. And this was pretty much the first prototype weapon developed by the Armalite company, but was also kind of their first failure. In total, only 25 prototypes were made and were given to various arms manufacturers with the hopes of obtaining a contract for manufacturing of the AR-1 Parasniper. But no one wanted this weapon, and this project was pretty much abandoned. There was an AR-2 or an Armalite AR-2 weapon, but unfortunately I cannot find any information on it, and I can only find a few notes on the weapon, but there is no design details. It doesn't tell you if it's a rifle, a submachine gun, a pistol, or a carbine. It's just the AR-2 did exist, at least on paper at one point. Another rifle that was developed by Eugene Stoner was the Armalite AR3, and this was an experimental battle rifle designed in 1955, and was one of the many rifles that were technically considered prototypes for the M14 series of battle rifles, or select fire battle rifles. This weapon here used a gas-operated rotating bolt and was chambered for the experimental .30 caliber T65 ammunition, and there was another prototype chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge. This weapon was also fitted with a 20-round magazine, and its rate of fire was anywhere from 500 to 700 rounds per minute. This weapon here, like I said, is one of many weapons that led to the M14 series of select fire battle rifles, but ultimately the M14 would be abandoned for the M16, and the AR3 prototype never made it past the prototype stage, as the M14 would become the standard issued U.S. Army service rifle up until the mid-1960s, when the M16 was later unveiled as the XM177. So the Armalite AR3 is one of the many, failed prototypes for the Armalite company that never made it past the prototype stage. Another Armalite weapon was the Armalite AR5, also known by the U.S. Air Force as the MA-1. and this was actually an Air Force survival rifle that was developed in 1955. This weapon here was a bolt-action takedown survival rifle, very similar to the later AR-7. This weapon here was chambered for the .22 Hornet cartridge, which was the Air Force issued 22 caliber ammunition, instead of the standard 22 long rifle that you would see now on the civilian market nowadays. The weapon was fed by a 4-round detachable box magazine and was extremely lightweight, only weighing about 2.5 pounds or 1.25 kilograms. This weapon was designed by both Eugene Stoner and George Sullivan in 1955, and only a small number of these were used by the U.S. Air Force up until 1959, when production of this weapon was canceled in favor of the Armalite AR7, also known as the Armalite AR7 Explorer. The AR-7 Explorer became one of the more standard issue survival rifles for the U.S. Air Force during the middle of the Cold War, and this was a semi-automatic takedown survival rifle that you can actually find today on the civilian market. This weapon was introduced in 1959 and was the replacement for the Armalite AR5. This weapon was chambered for the more standard .22 long rifle and was fed by either an 8 to 15 round detachable box magazine, although the 8-round magazine was the standard magazine for this weapon. This weapon here would go on to be one of the most successful Armalite weapons, especially for the civilian markets, as this weapon is still sold widely throughout the U.S. and in other countries as a survival weapon and as a cheap hunting rifle, being chambered in the standard 22 long rifle. Another prototype Armalite weapon was a shotgun. Yes, the Armalite company actually did attempt to enter the shotgun market, and they had developed in 1955 the AR9, or the Armalite AR9, which was a prototype semi-automatic short recoil action shotgun from 1955, and only a small number of these prototypes were actually made. These weapons were chambered for the 12-gauge shell and were fed by a 2-round tubular magazine. And that 2-round magazine is one of the reasons why this weapon never really went that far. This weapon was pretty light, only weighing about 5.5 pounds, and was developed by a man named Burton Miller, who was also a member of the Armalite development crew. This shotgun project was pretty much canceled, but was later revived in 1964 as the AR-17. And the AR-17 was pretty much the same gun and concept, although it had some minor differences when it comes to appearance. And over 1,200 of the AR-17s were actually sold in the U.S. on the civilian market, with I believe some of these also being used in Vietnam for a very short period of time before they were eventually sent back because the 2-round magazine capacity made them pretty useless on the battlefields of Vietnam. And these weapons are so rare that they are sought after by many arms collectors, as only 1,200 of them were ever produced. Now let's go to the AR-10, or the Armalite AR-10, or the Fairchild Armalite AR-10. And here are some of the prototypes that were developed by Eugene Stoner in the years before and during the early years of the Armalite company. Now the AR-10 actually started off as an experimental battle rifle in 1953 that was developed by Eugene Stoner, and this weapon was known as the Stoner M8 SN X01. And this was an experimental select-fire battle rifle chambered for the old .30-06 Springfield cartridge, which was the same cartridge still being used in the M1 Garand at this time. This weapon was fitted with a 20-round magazine from the old Browning automatic rifle and had a rate of fire of anywhere between 450 and 600 rounds per minute. This was a select-fire rifle, a semi-automatic/fully automatic rifle, and had a gas-operating rotating bolt, but it had a side-mounted gas piston, something that you didn't see on the Armalite AR-10 that this weapon would evolve into. Now, when Eugene Stoner joined the Armalite company in 1954, he took this prototype and continued to develop it into several other prototypes. The next prototype was the Fairchild Armalite AR-10 SN X02, which is the second version or second prototype for the AR-10, and this was a select fire battle rifle from 1954, and it was chambered for the experimental .30 T65 ammunition, and a second version was chambered for the 7.62 by 51mm NATO, and was fitted with a 20-round magazine. And this was pretty much the first true, I guess, AR-10 prototype. There were two other prototypes that were developed later on before the introduction of the AR-10, and these were the Fairchild and Armalite AR-10A SN X03, and this was the second to last, the final variant before the standard production model, and this was developed in 1955 and was chambered again for the experimental .30 T65 ammunition, and later the 7.62 by 51mm NATO cartridge. And then finally, in 1956, the standard version of the AR-10, the production model, entered production in 1956, and only about 10,000 AR-10s were actually produced in total. So the AR-10 didn't really see much service when compared to the M16, one of the weapons that evolved from the AR-10. But the AR-10 was pretty much the standard of the Armalite weapon systems, and would become the standard for almost all other Armalite rifles produced after 1956. Eventually the AR-15 and the AR-16 and the AR-180 would be developed later on towards the middle of the Cold War, but eventually the Armalite company would go out of business in the late 1980s. Later on in the 1990s, the Armalite brand was later picked up by another company, so you still see the Armalite brand existing today, but there is actually no Armalite company or manufacturing base like there was in the 1950s, 60s, all the way up to the 1980s. And so there you have it. These were some of the experimental Armalite weapons that were developed in the early years of the Armalite company, during the early years of Eugene Stoner and George Sullivan and Charles Dorchester and other developers who worked in the Armalite company during the Cold War. So which of these prototypes did you like the most? If I had to choose, my favorite would be the Armalite AR3, as it pretty much looks like an M1 Garand fused with an M14 and an M1 carbine all in one, but it is a prototype battle rifle, and that weapon never saw any service. So what do you all think of these weapons? So please tell me in the comment section below, and until next time, this was J-Man Time, signing off.